Welcome back to the Middle Ages now that you've had your break in the modern world. Um, we're the second half of week one. We are going to take a look at the medieval Renaissance in an overview. We're going to try to sort of touch all the bases and give you a little taste of what the rest of the course is going to be about, what sorts of things we're going to cover in this course. And I'm going to show you some of the artwork as much as I can of the original artwork and illustrations and what the people look like, so that you will, to really get you in the mood for the Middle Ages. Okay, what do we mean by the flowering of the Middle Ages? I actually coined that title from a book written about literary history. The flowering of the Middle Ages is really the 12th century Renaissance, and it's the medieval golden age. It's the time when medieval culture reached the highest peak of its development. And it was a very vibrant time, a very exciting time when a lot of wonderful things were going on. And I want to sort of show you some of these things. Here, for example, is a picture of a medieval garden with women in it enjoying themselves and playing musical instruments and gardening and with their children. So I thought a garden was a nice image for the flowering of the Middle Ages. And we'll look at different aspects of it. What is a Renaissance? Can anybody tell me what a Renaissance is? You want to do the mic? Okay.
It's a rebirth, and generally in history it refers to sort of a rebirth of knowledge and discovery of the world around you.
Okay, that's a very good definition of it. The word Renaissance means, Renaissance is how the English pronounce it, which means rebirth. In fact, a rebirth, it's usually a period, when you think of the period before it as being more, I don't want to say stagnant, but sort of quieter and duller and not so vibrant and not so exciting and not going on. The very first Renaissance that was identified really by Jacob Burckhardt in the 19th century, who identified the Italian Renaissance, which happened in the Quattrocento, the 14th century. It really starts as early as the 11th century in Italy, and the Italian Renaissance runs then through the 15th century, the 16th century, and it eventually gets transferred to Northern Europe, and all the values of the Italian Renaissance seem to take over all of Europe. And it used to be thought that the Italian Renaissance was the Renaissance and the only Renaissance. It was really begun by Petrarch in the 12th century, who sat on the hills outside of Rome looking over the city, and suddenly it dawned on him that there was a whole culture that had existed before his own time, and all the people were now dead. And so he sort of focused on Rome. Rome used to be there, and now it isn't there anymore. And what happened to Rome? And there was this great revival of learning, and there was a great interest in looking at the literature of the past, especially Roman and Greek literature that had not been explored for a long time. And Petrarch and his friends wrote to each other about the wonderful culture that had preceded them and that was no longer there anymore, and they sought to revive it. This recognition that there was a dead past there that they could revive signaled a paradigm shift and a change in the way the Italians defined themselves, a way in which they looked at themselves as the recreator of Roman culture. And one of the things the Italians did was defining themselves as not Gothic, in other words, not German and not European, not Northern European, and not of medieval culture. In other words, they made a very conscious break with the medieval past by defining themselves as not medieval and not Germanic. And in fact, they really viewed Northern Europe as Germanic slayers of the Roman culture. They viewed the Germans as those who destroyed that beautiful Roman culture. And so they then labeled the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, because the beautiful culture of Rome had been destroyed, and in its place was what they called Gothic darkness. And so part of the reason why the Middle Ages are sometimes called the Dark Ages is because the Italians labeled it that, and we sort of swallowed their propaganda. But as we look at the Middle Ages, as we will in this class, I think we'll see that it's not dark at all. It's a very beautiful and very productive period. Let's look a little bit at Italian culture, and I want to show you some examples of the kind of culture that the Italians created, in which they tried very hard to reinvent Roman culture. Of course, that's impossible. It's impossible to recreate something that happened in the past, but they try to do it with a new. And what they do is create a whole new culture. But one of the things we notice about this picture, for example, is it has depth and perspective. And this is something that they bring back, that they saw that the Romans used in their art. And so the Italians then tried to do this. This is a Venetian readable in the style of an illuminated manuscript. Here is the kind of portrait that's associated with the Italian Renaissance. This is Fra Angelico, who's a very famous artist of the Italian Renaissance. And again, portraiture is usually thought of as Italian Renaissance rather than medieval, that this is typical of the Renaissance, this kind of portraiture. Here is a painting in the style of the school of Leonardo da Vinci, which again captures the essence of what Renaissance art is all about, the realism, the depth of perspective, the volume of the body, so it looks very realistic. It doesn't look flat and symbolic like medieval art does, but it's very realistic, and it's almost photographic in its quality. Here's another example of Italian art. This is the Patriarch Job, a painting on a panel by Fra Bartolomeo. And again, I just want you to look at the styles that are typically Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, so that you'll see the difference when we look at medieval art. Here is a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. I probably should have a paper to put over that, but here's a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci over here, and you can see again that portraiture. And here is the Assumption of the Virgin with a celestial concert, which is very Renaissance in conception, the kind of thing that Renaissance painting did. And what it tries to do is recreate what was done in ancient Rome. And to allow you to compare, I have a painting here from ancient Rome. This is a painting in the house of Livia on the Palatine Hill in Rome that shows medieval, not medieval, but classical Roman art. And the Italian Renaissance was pretty good at recreating that style. Here's just one more example. This is a 12th century Italian, again, Psalter, and so it shows the kind of Renaissance style. Here are some buildings. These are actually French that recreate the French medieval, or not French medieval, but French Renaissance style when it's transferred to France. And you can see, I mean, it's a reproduction of some of this looks just like the Pantheon in Rome. And so the French try to recreate that with their buildings. Here is the interior of a building of that style. This is the interior of St. Peter's in Rome, and you can see that it's very, you can see the typical Renaissance style, the Italian Renaissance. Here is, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to turn this Here is St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which is the Italian Renaissance style transferred to the north. And this is very Renaissance in conception. Here is the interior of St. Paul's in Rome, again, Renaissance in perception. Okay, so I've given you a look at what the Italians were doing. The Italians were the ones who labeled the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, 1,000 years of Gothic darkness, 1,000 years without a bath. It's kind of like that's what the Germans deserved for killing the Roman Empire. And so we'll label that. The Italians saw themselves as reviving classical Rome and Greece, and some of the concepts they had of themselves was that they were man-centered, not God-centered, that they cared about human activities and human activities in the world more than they did about religious activities. That actually isn't true, because the Italian Renaissance is very religious. I've just shown you a bunch of religious pictures that were done in Italian Renaissance style, but that's like one of the myths of the Italian Renaissance, that it's humanistic, whereas the Middle Ages were all they did was pray. And so I hope to show you that that's not really true. But one of their strivings was to revive Greek and Roman learning, and they glorified human achievement. Another of the qualities of the Italian Renaissance was that they were practical rather than ideal, and they tended to think of the Middle Ages of medieval Europe as more idealistic. But people like Machiavelli, for example, gave realistic directions about how a king should rule his kingdom, and do it in political ways, facing political realities and not trying to recreate sort of the kingdom of heaven in doing that. The art is much more realistic rather than being symbolic, and indeed during the Italian Renaissance there was a burst of artistic production. I've just shown you a bunch of it. Education was widespread, ironically because of a medieval invention. Actually, the printing press was invented in medieval Germany in the late 15th century, and it's a medieval invention that comes from the same kind of trends that produce the watermill and the wine press and the windmill and all the medieval inventions. So it's kind of ironic that the printing press speeds up the Italian Renaissance. Another thing that distinguishes the Italian Renaissance is it's town-centered, not rural. In fact, the towns of northern Italy were where the Italian Renaissance was born, and that's where the activities centered in the town squares, in the marketplaces of the towns. Whereas we tend to think of medieval Europe as being more rural, you know, being based on the manor house and in the countryside. Again, this is a myth, and I'm going to show you why this is a myth. The Italian Renaissance is thought of as trade-centered and not agricultural-based, but rather commercial in its character. I hope that a lot of you will read Robert Lopez on the Commercial Revolution and see that the Middle Ages was likewise trade-centered. Okay? And again, the Italian Renaissance wanted to think of itself as earth-centered, not heaven-centered, and that Italian Roman brilliance was creating a whole new culture rather than Gothic darkness. So a lot of it is propaganda. A lot of it is their own hype, you know, creating this myth of their own identity. It's like an identity thing where they're creating their own identity at the expense of their enemy, which is the Germanic Middle Ages. And so you have to think of it as a lot of propaganda in a way. Well, what is the reality of the medieval Renaissance? Let's try to get a handle on that. And again, I'm going to have to turn my book a little bit. Here is another picture that personifies what we think of as the Middle Ages. And here we have an aristocratic lady at her leisure, and she is accompanied by musicians who are serenading her as she takes her rest. And so this is particularly medieval in conception here. Is Leroy des Minstrels, the King of Minstrels, that's what it says. Okay, how do we get from the Italian Renaissance to the medieval Renaissance? It's not easy because, of course, Jacob Burckhardt really lauded the Italian Renaissance in the 19th century, and according to 19th century historians, that was the Renaissance. There was no other Renaissance. But a very great medievalist, Charles Homer Haskins, writing in 1927, identified the medieval Renaissance. And he did this in a set of really 3 books. And if you'll focus on the paper again, I have Charles Homer Haskins, who's a very important character. He identified the Renaissance of the 12th century in really 3 books. One general book written for the general public called The Renaissance of the 12th Century was a very readable, very literate book, written as a popular book that lots of people could read. The scholarship behind the Renaissance of the 12th century was in a book called Medieval Science. And medieval science is, when you open the book, you'll find that the pages are half Latin footnotes. I mean, it's a very scholarly book and kind of tough to read. But the task that Haskins set before himself was to identify the qualities in the Middle Ages that were like the Italian Renaissance. He concentrated on looking for the revival of classical learning, for one thing, that characteristic of the Italian Renaissance that he saw as so typical of it. And he knew that this happened in the Middle Ages as well, and he did his research in Toledo in Spain, which fell in, I believe it's 1085, not 1086, that Toledo fell to the Europeans, or to the Christians. It was a Muslim city, and the Christians reconquered it. And at that point, Toledo became a center of translation, and it's so interesting to read about the transmission of learning from Toledo into Northern Europe, because it goes through this torturous way of books that were originally written in Greek or Latin and have then been copied into Persian or Egyptian Coptic or Arabic or other languages, and then they're translated into Spanish, and from Spanish they're translated into Latin, and only then can the Europeans read them. And so these books go through translation and retranslation and retranslation, and finally the scholars who are waiting, just panting for this knowledge outside of Toledo, they finally get their hands on these books. And scholars came from all over Europe and gathered around Toledo, and schools of Spanish translators act as the transmission of these manuscripts. One of the most famous of these people is Adelard of Bath, who was an Englishman, and he actually brought the abacus, the Chinese abacus, which is the first adding machine, and he took that from Toledo and he brought it to England, and of course he became very renowned for his mathematical knowledge and his scientific knowledge, because he brought this calculating instrument back to England, and it actually gave England a step forward, a sort of step up in managing their treasury, because they used it to calculate the taxes as they collected them, and they calculated, they sort of transferred the idea of the abacus to a checkered cloth, and they put markers on it to add up the taxes as they collected them, and that's why the English treasury is called the exchequer. It's named after that checkered cloth that they used to add up the taxes. And so in very unexpected ways, this transferring of knowledge affected the countries of Europe as the revival of classical learning affected Europe all over the place. Another center of translation was Palermo in Sicily. And of course, you've all heard of William the Conqueror, right? Okay, if you don't know anybody else in English history, you know William the Conqueror, who conquered England in when? 1066, right. And so he was a Norman. He was from Normandy on the coast of northern France, and the Normans were descended from the Vikings, so they had a kind of Viking heritage. So William conquered England, but that's the famous Norman conquest. There's another Norman conquest that is not quite as well known, and that is the Normans who went south into Italy. And at the same time that William was conquering England, another group of Normans, not led by one man, it was a more gradual conquest, but they actually conquered southern Italy over a period of about 50 years. And by 1091 to 92, they were conquering Sicily from the Muslims. The Muslims also had control of Sicily. And so the Normans conquered Sicily, and Palermo was the capital city of Muslim Sicily. It became the Norman capital of Sicily, and that too became a huge center of translation. So that, what have we done here? We have already dispelled the myth that it was the Crusades who brought Greek and Roman learning back to Europe, haven't we? It wasn't the Crusades, because both of these conquests, the fall of Toledo and the fall of Palermo, happened before the First Crusade. So that all of this Greek and Latin learning was pouring into Europe well before the Crusades. And this was giving a boost to the medieval Renaissance. So Charles Homer Haskins was the one who identified all of this activity going on, the revival of learning, the revival of Latin, the revival of education. And he concentrated on Greeks like Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle comes in through Toledo and Palermo into Europe, and this is part of the discovery of Greek culture. It's philosophical, it's scientific, it's intellectual. In the past 70 years, Haskins' concept has been accepted, confirmed conclusively, and extended and expanded. Not only have all medievalists said this is absolutely right, the Haskins thesis of the 12th century Renaissance is absolutely true. Not only that in the fields that he identified, but in many, many other fields as well. Music and art and literature and all of the things that are flowering all over Europe. So in the last 70 years, other scholars have gone far beyond what Haskins did, and now his theory is universally acknowledged as right, except those who are brainwashed by the Italians. But everybody who knows this history knows that the 12th century Renaissance is absolutely right. And in the years, intervening years, scholars have begun to discover other Renaissances. Well, if there was a Renaissance in the 12th century, could there have been Renaissances preceding that Renaissance? And in fact, scholars have found them. They found a Northumbrian Renaissance in England in the 700s. Who is the scholar? Does anybody know the scholar who is so important in England in the 700s and 800s?
Honorable Bede.
Bede, yes, of course. Around Bede, there was a school, a flowering school that is called the Northumbrian Renaissance. The Carolingian Renaissance in France in the 800s and 900s, the Carolingian Renaissance was generated by Charlemagne, and Charlemagne very consciously tried to revive Latin learning and scholarship and artistic production and to recreate the Roman Empire. So here is another Renaissance that precedes the 12th century Renaissance. And then, as the Carolingian Empire faded away under the attacks largely of the Vikings and the Magyars, the Ottonians built a kingdom in Germany in the 900s and 1000s, and lo and behold, we have an Ottonian Renaissance that was largely spurred by Byzantine forces. Otto II married a Byzantine princess, and she brought with her all kinds of Byzantine artists from Constantinople, and artists and scholars, and had a whole school, and there was a huge revival of art and literature and learning in the Ottonian Renaissance. So all of these prior Renaissances presaged and prepared for the 12th century Renaissance, or the flowering of the Middle Ages. And I want to show you a little bit of the art of these different Renaissances. This is the kind of art that is 5th century. This is, I guess this is the only period we could really label as barbarian art, where the art has still not formed its character. It hasn't got an identity to it. It's still rather nebulous. But 5th century is Roman forms are fading away, and nothing has evolved to take their place yet. And this is the kind of art that we see from that period. Now, here is the kind of art that we see in the Renaissance, the Northumbrian Renaissance, the Renaissance in England. And here are some Saxon warriors. This little quick sketch kind of drawing is an example of the kind of artwork that is done. As one example. Here is a manuscript page, and I'm going to pull this down just a bit so we can see the top of it. This is part of that Northumbrian Renaissance, which is not only the revival of writing in Latin and in fact Greek also. In the Northumbrian Renaissance there were Greek scholars who preserved Greek works, but also writing in the vernacular in English. And this is a manuscript done in English. This is Caedmon. This is a facsimile of the first page of Caedmon. Here we see some of the characteristics that are going to be typical of medieval art. For example, this initial right here, this V, is formed out of these fishes, and sort of monster fishes. Or are they? What are they? Lizards or fishes? I thought they were fishes, but maybe they're birds. They're strange animals, whatever they are. and this marks the medieval imagination. This is medieval. I mean, and it's not post-Roman anymore, nebulous, unclear, unidentified. I mean, it's really got a personality. And here we see the birth of really medieval ideas in this manuscript. And then this manuscript is a picture of St. Gregory the Great. This is in your readings book, by the way. This is St. Gregory the Great, who is regarded as the founder of the medieval papacy. And he also is the one who sent the missionaries to England to convert the pagan Germans who were there, the Angles and the Saxons, to convert them back to Christianity. And so he's thought of as the apostle to the English. But this is, I mean, there's a lot of classical feeling in this manuscript. Can you see that there's an attempt at realism? There's an attempt at depth. A Roman arch crowns the seat of the Pope. And if you look very closely, if we could focus in maybe on this little small picture here, is that possible to focus in on this one? And you can see that there's a revival of classical realism. There's an attempt to go back to Roman forms of classical realism. And so that's what a Renaissance is. As you said, it's a rebirth and an attempt to bring back forms of the ancient world. And they were doing that in Ottonian England. Okay, and now we'll go back to the next one. We'll turn our book again. This is an initial of the Celtic Carolingian type, and the Carolingian Renaissance, carried on by Charlemagne, goes much farther in the revival of classical forms. But again, it has a quality of inventiveness that is characteristic of a Renaissance, as well as the revival of classical learning. Another component of all the Renaissances we've looked at is creativity, that they are creating new ideas, new forms, new concepts, new ways of looking at the world. And this is certainly true of the Carolingian Renaissance, where we see that the personality, again, this medieval personality coming out in this wonderful historiated initial. Here is another historiated initial, and it is a T of the 9th century. Again, this is a continuation of the Carolingian Renaissance, where we see new inventiveness. We see all these vines twirling around with figures on this cross. Even though it's a T, it's kind of a cross too. And again, inventiveness, new ideas, new kinds of concepts. Here is another example of this. Again, this is the Carolingian Renaissance. The initials and ornaments of the Anglo-Saxons, but this is the 9th and the 10th century, so it's really Carolingian in character, and combination of Carolingian and Anglo-Saxon. But the fancifulness, the kind of almost humor that you see, that is typically medieval. And so, classic. You can appreciate other art than just classical. You have to look at medieval art as something that has a personality of its own. Here is an example of a Carolingian book cover. And I know it's hard to see in a black and white photograph, but the outer rim of this book cover, and it's huge, it's enormous, it's about this big. I mean, it's really a huge book. And the outer edge of it is gold, and it's encrusted with jewels, with emeralds and rubies and pearls. And the inner part of it, the lighter part of it here, is ivory. It's either ivory that's carved or it's gold that's been cast. It doesn't say here. And it's I mean, it's a work of art on its own, and new art forms are being found in this Renaissance, new creativity of various kinds. I won't go into all the detail. Here is an image of Charles the Bald, and again, this is from the Carolingian Renaissance, which is again reviving classical forms in a way, but also creating new forms in kings. There were no kings in the Roman Empire. Well, there were kings, they were client kings, but they're totally different from medieval kings. Medieval kingship is a new invention. So here is the King Charles the Bald. Notice the little hand reaching down over his head. Of course, that's the hand of God who's designating him as king. And so it's symbolic at the same time that it's a revival of classicism. Note the Roman columns and the Roman pediment at the top. There are Roman elements in it as well. This is King Lothar enthroned, a miniature from the manuscript about 845 AD, and he is another of the Carolingian kings who takes his place in the artwork. Again, you can see the classical forms. They're attempting to do the draperies, and they're showing an arch over his head. It's an attempted classical revival. This is Ottonian by contrast with the Carolingian, and the Ottonian art is far more Byzantine in character, but Byzantine is Roman. I mean, Byzantine is late Roman, and so you have a lot of realism, a lot of volume in the bodies, a lot of architectural background. This happens to be Otto I, who is the first king of the Ottonian Empire in Germany, and the companion, and these are his courtiers on each side of him. Here are his bishops, and here are his barons on this side. And this is the companion picture to that, which is a picture that is very symbolic. The subject countries doing homage to the Emperor Otto II from a manuscript of the Gospels. And if you can read the Latin above the heads of each of these characters, can you read the Latin to see who they are? Okay, who's the first one? What does this say? What do you think this says? Sclavinia. The Slavs are doing homage to him, the Slavs. And who is the second person? Germania. In Latin we would say Germania. And who is the third person? Can you read? Gallia, that's France. And the fourth person is Roma. Yes, so that Otto is thinking of himself as the emperor of all of Europe. He's thinking of himself as being very Carolingian in character, and so here he envisions all of Europe doing homage to him. So he has ambitions to be like a Roman Empire. Again, this is part of the Ottonian Renaissance. So here they are. So these are the Renaissances that precede the 12th century Renaissance. And right now I'd like to put all of this into a temporal and cultural framework. The Renaissance, as I said, we can date to from about 1000 to about 1350. And the Renaissance starts, 1,000 years really, 100 years before the 12th century. Well, what happened in the year 1000? Essentially, the year 1000 has a lot of things going on. It becomes very exciting in Europe. All of a sudden, things change, and they change very drastically. First of all, what the year 1000 is the end of the Viking, Magyar, and Saracen invasions. From the time of the Carolingian Empire, as the Carolingian Empire broke up, the Vikings helped it along by robbing and stealing and looting and burning. So the Vikings sort of put everything into chaos, and really France fell into ruins. The Magyars, the Vikings came from the north, the Magyars came from the east, and they swept in all over Germany, and they swept over France, and Europe was really in a pincer movement. Besides the attacks coming from the north and the east, attacks were also coming from the south. The Saracens, Muslim pirates, were attacking the soft underbelly of Europe. So Europe was in this pincer movement. It was really thrown into the fire. It was being tested in the fire. And it emerged from that terrible time in the year 1000 with a totally new perception of itself, a new personality, and a new character. There was a paradigm shift that clearly marks the end of the early Middle Ages and the beginning of the High Middle Ages. There's a new sense of reality. And a lot of this sense of reality was fueled by a technological and economic takeoff. Are any of you economics majors? Are you familiar with the term economic takeoff, which is something people are trying to make happen in the third world? In third world countries, they're trying to make an economic takeoff happen. Well, a model economic takeoff happened in the Middle Ages, in medieval Europe, and it happens about the year 1000. And along with this economic takeoff went all kinds of economic advances that made everybody rich and happy. And so there was a burst of confidence and a sense of integration, and helping the economic takeoff was a long period of internal peace. Now that the attacks were over, Europe was not a place of constant warfare. That's kind of a myth, that medieval Europe was constant warfare. In fact, they very rarely fought battles. When battles were fought, it was typically the besieging of a city, what they would do would be blockade the city and starve it out. They seldom fought a pitched battle, and when they did fight a pitched battle, they didn't try to kill each other. They tried to take each other prisoner, to hold them for ransom, and to take their horses, their valuable horses and their armor. And so, you know, it's a myth that all these people in Europe were killing each other. There was a long period of internal peace after the Viking invasions were over with. So here is Europe, the physical characteristics. We can look at the map of Europe and see where the locations are, and the places we're going to be talking about are Spain. Here is Spain, and France or Gaul in this area, Germany in this area, the German Empire, which extends down into Italy partly, but the Normans are down here in the south. Here, of course, is England and Scandinavia over here. It's in this period that we see, those are the classic sort of early medieval countries. In this period of the High Middle Ages, we see the formation of a lot of new kingdoms. We're going to see the formation of the Scandinavian kingdoms as they're Christianized. On the edges of Germany are Poland and Russia. Russia, of course, is a Viking foundation. The Vikings founded Russia. Poland and Hungary. The Magyars miraculously converted to Christianity and turned into Hungarians and became the Kingdom of Hungary. And so all the Eastern European countries are added to Europe in the High Middle Ages. And so state building is an important thing that goes on. Here we have a map of Western Europe. We can see the countries in relation to each other. Here you can see Spain and France and Germany, England up here. This is at the end of our period, about 1360. One of the things that fueled this economic takeoff was the invention of the heavy plow. And here is a picture of the heavy plow. The stick plow was used in the sandy soils of Roman and Greek countries around the Mediterranean, but the stick plow wouldn't work in Northern Europe, in the heavy, wet clay soils of Northern Europe. And so up until the year 1000, Northern Europe was covered with forests. Nobody could clear the forests. And it's the heavy plow that allowed them to clear the forest. So there's lots of land clearing going on, new planting, opening up of new lands, and that helped to spur, was one of the factors that helped to spur the economic takeoff. Another factor that helped spur the economic takeoff, and here we can see this economic takeoff with the farming, the harvesting. Actually, the harvest increased because they were planting better crops along with the heavy plow, and so the harvesting increased the amount of food available, and it also supplied surpluses so that people could begin to trade. And we see the growth of fairs or markets that grow up around monasteries and around castles, and as time goes by, the fairs become permanent markets, and then they become towns, so that towns are springing up all over Europe. Part of this is a great time of town growth. Part of it is the mechanism of the mill, and we mentioned the water mill earlier as the machine that really powered the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages. But what could you do if you didn't have a stream on your land, or you weren't on a river, or you weren't on a tidal basin so that you could have a water mill? You couldn't have one. You simply remained poor while your neighbors on the river grew rich. Somebody in the 12th century invented the windmill. They said, well, we can harness the wind if we can't harness the water, and so the windmill was invented, and you could knock up a post mill in a matter of hours. It's very easy to build, and they just popped up all over Europe. There were thousands and thousands of windmills, and so Europe really suddenly became empowered. It was just full of power machines, including water mills and windmills. And so this is part of the industrial revolution, the economic takeoff of Europe. The growth of towns and commerce, and the growth of the agricultural production meant that this is a period of great prosperity. It meant a lot of leisure time for people, so that people had time to do more than farm for food. And of course the new towns had an urban population that were not farmers. They were bakers and carpenters and builders. And so you have the growth of craftsmen. There's great artistic creativity, and the two great styles are Romanesque and Gothic. And of course, there's a huge building boom. All over Europe, the towns rivaled each other to see who could build the biggest churches. In the early years of the 12th century Renaissance, most of the churches were monasteries. The monasteries were the only ones who could afford to build giant churches. But as time went on, the towns became richer from trade, and they started building cathedrals that were even huger than the monasteries. And so there was a huge building boom. And attached to these cathedrals were first schools were attached to the monasteries, and then they were attached to the cathedrals. The universities were attached to the cathedrals. And so with the growth of town and the building booms were the growth of universities. It's absolutely a myth that no one traveled more than 5 miles from their home in the Middle Ages. That is a myth. People traveled constantly. It was widespread. There was trade, and there were pilgrimages. Everybody was going on pilgrimage. They went to St. James of Compostela. They went to Rome. They went to the Holy Land. They went to Canterbury. They went to shrines all over Europe. Europe was constantly on the move, and people traveled back and forth, and there was a lot of exchange of information. I want to show you some pictures of those things, and I'm going to sort of block off. Okay. Here, for example, is a town. You see the growth of Marseille in southern France, and you see the town plan as the town is growing larger. Here are some merchants who travel back and forth and go from town to town. Merchants who are trading in goods, and that's what the label says. On top of there it says merchants, in French, of course. And here is another town. This is Lübeck. This is in northern Germany. Lübeck was the center of the North Sea trading route, a huge network of trade that rivaled Mediterranean trade in the northern world. And that was a legacy of the Vikings, by the way, that the North Sea trade was as good as the... You want to use the mic for your question?
Wasn't the water cold for much of the year for them to trade?
Yeah, but it wasn't frozen. I mean, the North Sea is still a center, it is still a trading network. And the trade between England across the English Channel and the Baltic lands and Russia, well, not really Russia, but more Scandinavia. I mean, there was a huge trade. And that's something that you don't think of. You don't think of the close connections along the North Sea trading routes, and they were there. And Lübeck was one of the center of the towns that were linked together in those trading routes. There's also revival of the currency, and here are some coins from that period. I'm sorry, it's a little dark on one edge, but here are Merovingian coins of Chilperic and Dagobert and Pepin the Short, Charlemagne, and here we get into the medieval period of the 12th century Renaissance, the florin of Louis IX, and the great tournois. This is the money of Tournou, of silver. okay, with a cross in the middle. And so the revival of coinage, one of the reasons that allowed coinage to revive was the discovery of gold and silver deposits in Germany. And this is one way in which the watermill really helped out, because with a watermill they could process the ore. They could process the raw ore. They could pump water out of the mines with the watermills. They could use them with bellows to refine the gold and the silver. And so the mining industry was growing. In addition to finding these new resources of gold and silver, the mining technology was improving dramatically at the time. And so we see the growth of towns like this one, which is a grand perspective of Paris in 1607, after, of course, it had reached its medieval growth. So you can even recognize some of the buildings of Paris. Well, what do you think this is? Can you tell what that is?
Notre Dame?
It's Notre Dame, right. That's Notre Dame Cathedral, and let's see if there are any other landmarks. I think this is Sainte-Chapelle, the St. Louis Chapel over here. And here are some other churches around Paris, but you could even see the landmarks in the town. So the growth of towns. We also see the creativity and the growth of just creativity and invention at the time. This, for example, this miniature of the birth of the Virgin shows a whole new dimension to miniature painting. What do you notice about this that seems new, that we haven't seen in any of the miniatures before in the manuscript paintings? What seems new here that you haven't seen before? Yeah.
It seems like there's added perspective and depth, but I mean it's a little more intricate than the other ones had been. But I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you're looking for.
It does have some added perspective and depth. What I kind of see that's new is that border. I mean, with all those twining vines and the wonderful little birds and animals and things in it,
arches cover the people in the picture there.
Could you repeat that, please?
The lines coming down from the arches, it shows that the people are in kind of like a back room or an alcove there.
Oh, excellent. Yes, that enhances the perspective, doesn't it? It makes them look like they're in a setting, in a scene that has depth to it. And so there's a lot of inventiveness going on, a lot of creativity and re-envisioning the world around them. How about this one? This is a German manuscript, a miniature representing King Conrad of Bohemia. This is actually from the Manessa manuscript, which we have a facsimile of this entire manuscript in our library. So go up to the rare books room and look at it sometime. But this is from the Manessa manuscript, and here they are hawking. And this is very medieval in concept. I'm just showing a medieval scene of hawking. And so this is the creativity that's going on. Now look at this one, a miniature from the Benedictional of Athelwald. Okay, this is 12th century from Winchester. And we get an entirely different image here. And one of the things about creativity is it's different everywhere. They're not carbon copying each other. I mean, they're all off doing their own little individual thing. I mean, the artists are expressing themselves in very different ways. And so they're creating very different types of pictures, and everything is diversifying. Everything is getting multiplied. So there are lots of different ways of doing things. Typical of this is the Romanesque church. The Romanesque church is more typically a monastery church that's attached to a monastery, and this is Romanesque. And one of the things about the Romanesque churches is they're very experimental. What they do is in the Romanesque period, which is really the 10th and 11th century, it's started by Charlemagne, he's the first one to do it, is they take all the elements of Roman architecture, like arches and columns and domes and pillars, and they recombine them in new ways. Nobody would ever mistake this for a Roman building. It's not Roman, it's medieval. And the Romanesque churches are extremely experimental. You can go to a Romanesque church in southern France and travel 20 miles away to another one, and they will be strikingly different. And in England, they're doing something different still. Everybody's experimenting and trying new things out and trying to see how they can combine them in the most pleasing way. And one of the interesting things that happens is they finally do find a pleasing combination, and that is the Gothic cathedral. Now we go to the Gothic style. And the Gothic cathedral pleases everybody. This is Notre Dame in Paris, which is the first Gothic cathedral. And the combination of elements ends up to be so pleasing to everyone that it becomes the standard, and everybody copies that French style. And they're not exactly alike. They differ in details, but in general conception, the Gothic churches are very similar to each other. The elements are constructed in the same way. And when they build the churches, the only thing they really vary a lot is the height. They decide to, every city tries to build its cathedral bigger and higher than the others, and they soar higher and higher and higher until finally at Bourges it falls down. But not because it was too tall, because at Bourges the foundation, the ground is gumbo soil like Houston, and it shifts, and what they needed was a better foundation, so they rebuilt it with a better foundation, and it stands to this day. So they are master builders, and the technology involved in building these cathedrals is phenomenal. I mean, nothing of this size had been seen in world history since the pyramids. They're as big as the pyramids, and they're the first buildings as big as the pyramids. And a lot of new engineering techniques had to be invented in order to build these cathedrals. They had to learn to buttress the walls. They had to learn to make, the ceilings, of course, are stone. Let me show you the interior. The ceilings are stone, and those walls had to hold up those stone ceilings even though they were pierced. Look at these walls. They have arches. Great chunks of the wall have been taken out here, down here, and in the windows up here. The concept was to build skeleton walls and still at the same time have this huge stone ceiling that the wall had to hold up. And so you have a kind of optical illusion that heavy stone ceiling is floating on air, because they build those windows to create that optical illusion. So you have these walls of layered lace that are pierced like skeleton walls to hold up this enormous building. This is an achievement. This is one of the 7 wonders of the world, of all mankind, to build these kinds of buildings. And think of the money that it costs, the wealth that is involved to build, and the manpower involved to build these giant cathedrals. This is a reflection of the wealth of the medieval centuries. This is a monastic cloister that would have been attached to a cathedral. That the library or the school might have been in the cloister. It could be attached to a monastery. So that's another example of that architecture. And here is a close-up of the sculpture that would be found on the medieval cathedral. And again, we see in Charlemagne's time, the buildings that Charlemagne built were were solid walls. There was no sculpture. The Gothic cathedral was covered with sculpture, and this you can see rows and rows of figures and kings and priests and judges and animals of all kinds and faces along here, the animals, and so they're covered with stories. The medieval cathedral was meant to tell the story of the entire universe. It was to be a reflection of God's universe, and the whole universe was contained within the cathedral. All of human history, including poor people and common people, was included in the portraiture and the sculpture of the cathedral and in the stained glass. And so this is one of the enduring monuments to the ingenuity of mankind. I didn't have time to get very many castles, but in addition to the cathedrals and the church buildings, of course, castles were built everywhere. And this is a picture of Chateau Gaillard, Les Andelys, which was Richard Lionheart's castle in France, in northern France. And so you can sort of see a plan of that castle here. It's actually up on a very high hill, and it overlooks the whole countryside, which is what a castle did. It guarded the countryside. But in addition to the hundreds of cathedrals and churches, there were thousands of castles built everywhere in Europe, this huge building boom. One of the characteristics of the 12th century Renaissance is reason, system, and order. And so there was a movement to apply reason, to make everything systematic, to make everything orderly. And this was the process of state building. And part of this bringing order to society was legal systems. The recovery of Justinian's Code, which was Roman law, which was the law that France used, and English common law, which was really earlier than than Roman law came to Europe. The church grew in the same way that the state did. As the state became bureaucratic and centralized, so did the church. It adopted the same institutions, and there are parallel institutions between church and state, where the king had a council of barons around him who had to advise him. They were obligated to advise him, and he was obligated to hear their advice, to listen to it. The Pope also had the College of Cardinals around him, and they served the exact same function. So the church and the state are really mirror images of each other, and so watch for that in the 2 lectures we have on church and state. There are also a lot of social changes in the roles and the lives of men and women, and let's see a few illustrations of those. Here is actually Charlemagne receiving the homage of his barons, the King Charlemagne and his great feudatories. He served as the model for medieval kings. Medieval kings wanted to be like Charlemagne. Remember, I showed you Otto, who wanted to rule all of Europe like Charlemagne did. And so all the medieval kings in the 12th century also wanted to be like Charlemagne. Here is a medieval king and his court. Actually, I'm sorry, this is not a king. This is the Duke of Bourbon, and he's holding a court of justice, and those are his barons sitting as peers of the realm around his court in order to judge the cases. So law, the development of law is a very important aspect of the growth of government. Here is an actual king with his barons around him. This is Philip de Valois, who is judging Robert, Count of Artois, and there are the peers of the realm. Here are the bishops on one side, and here are the peers of the realm, and they're judging I think this is the defendant at court, and so there they are in the feudal court, judging the the criminals. And this is the creation of the medieval states. I have some maps here for you. These are actually the maps that you have in your handout book, but I've just colored them in so you could see more clearly where the countries are. This is the location of Germany. It's often called the Holy Roman Empire. As Voltaire said, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but it has that reputation, and it really was quite late that it was called the Holy Roman Empire. But the German kings called themselves emperors, and they had ambitions to rule all of Christendom, again on the model of Constantine. They were never very effective rulers. And in fact, in theory, they ruled Italy. In fact, they seldom controlled it unless they actually marched their army down there. And the Pope kept throwing roadblocks in their way and trying to torpedo them, and fomented civil war in Germany. So Germany never became a very strong state. France, on the other hand, started out very weak. I've colored it all yellow here to show that it's all France, but in fact it was very fragmented. And each of those counties, Normandy, Brittany, Maine, Orleans, Poitou, Gascony, all of those various areas, Champagne, Picardy, they were independent. The King of France was actually very weak, and France took a long time to build its kingdom up. It went from anarchy to strong union, largely because it had a strong king who pulled it together, and that was Philip Augustus, who pulled the kingdom of France together. But in the 12th century, he was just beginning to do that. I mean, France was not really pulled together yet. England, on the other hand, was unified very nicely by William the Conqueror, and here you can see it unified with Normandy, and England was the first really unified, organized, reason system and order kind of state. And the state building kind of began with William the Conqueror pulling together with Normandy. And here you can see how strong England was as it unified and pulled together. And of course, Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine. You all know that story. And here is Aquitaine, and he gained that, Aquitaine and Poitou, all of that added to the Norman territories of Normandy, Brittany, and Maine, and England, and he conquered Ireland. And look at the Plantagenet realm of Henry II. It's enormous. I mean, it looks like the English kings are really bringing to reality the kind of empire. And I've colored the area of France yellow here, so you can see what the King of France was faced with. There's the King of France in that yellow spot, and the white part of France, they were all independent barons, and there is the King of England looming over everything. So you can see why France and England are at each other's throats so much. Germany was fragmented too. And all of this was part of the state building that was going on. Here are some pictures of medieval people. Here are town burghers, and here are noble women. And so you can sort of see the kind of people that would live in this city and live in the 12th century. Here are some women with their children. You can see that. Women with their children, so you can see the people here. And here are some knights in battle, and remember that they're only sort of mock battles to see who can capture whom and hold them for ransom. Here are the men. Here is the kind of creativity. This is a manuscript that is actually in our library. This is a photograph of that manuscript, and it has this wonderful little dogs there. So in this same manuscript, there are wonderful dragons and musicians. And be sure to look at this manuscript when you go to the library and look at the manuscripts. It's really quite a beautiful one, and you can see the creativity and the joy that they have in these manuscripts. Here is another manuscript. I'm sorry it's upside down. Let me fix it here. It's upside down. There we have the manuscript. This is another one of the ones we have in our library, and again, these twining vines around it are really unique. Here's a cardinal, and then on the other side is let's take that off, is another part of that manuscript, and here we see some churchmen on this side. Okay, and here is a music manuscript. This also is in our library. It's a music manuscript, and you can see the early medieval music, which is part of the great creativity. The great invention of the 12th century Renaissance was polyphony. Before music was written down, and the writing of music was really invented because Charlemagne wanted to standardize the church liturgy. And so in order to standardize it, he had to write it down. And once music was written down, then you could play with it. Instead of just having one line of melody, you could write down, you could actually write another line of melody going a different direction, and that's polyphony. And all Western music today stems from that invention. All of it you listen to on the radio, to the popular music, classical music, all of it comes from this medieval invention of writing down the music. So I've shown you a lot of the new forms of experimentation, a lot of the new ideas that are coming out. In literary invention, courtly love ideals are invented. The idea of men and women actually being in love with each other. Romance is invented. In the artistic area, Romanesque and Gothic styles are invented. In the area of philosophy, there's a rediscovery of reason. In the political arena, there's the invention of the national state. In the legal arena, canon law and common law are ordered and codified. Music, the invention of polyphony. Technology, the watermill, the windmill. In architecture, the technology of the arch, the vault, and the buttress. In education, the invention of the university. In social forms, chivalry and manners, and all forms of experimentation of relations between the sexes and the classes, all sorts of experimentation. Also, a new world view is invented. In the early Middle Ages, Christ is seen in majesty as the great judge. The devil is seen as real. Mary is seen as Theotokos, Mother of God. In the High Middle Ages, there's a huge shift in the way they viewed the world. Christ is now seen as human, dead on the cross. The devil is a joke, and Mary is Queen of Heaven. Let's take a look at these. Here is Christ in majesty. This is a Carolingian picture. Christ is shown judging the world. Okay, here is another example of that. This example shows Christ in a mandorla as a judge of the world, crowning this Carolingian king. And so Christ is shown in that kind of a role. Here is Mary shown as Theotokos, the Christ bearer, in a Carolingian manuscript. Now look at the difference in how Christ is portrayed. He is portrayed on the cross as dead and dying on the cross. This stresses his humanity. The fact that he was human, that he took human form, that God so loved the world, that he gave his only son, that he gave his life for human beings. This made human beings feel beloved by God and cherished by God. And not only that, but human beings were made in God's image. And St. Anselm, the great philosopher whom you'll read about in the discovery of the individual, actually formulated the idea that men were perfectible, that God intended men to become godlike, to become perfected. And so they had this confidence that they could do anything. St. Thomas Aquinas thought that he could gather all knowledge and put it into a system of order, and that's what he did in his Summa Theologica, and he actually did. I mean, he could know all things. This kind of confidence is what makes the Renaissance, this human confidence. Look at this picture of the Virgin Mary. Now the Virgin Mary is seen as the loving mother who adores her child, and she becomes the intercessor between human beings and Christ, because who do you listen to the most? Well, your mother, of course. And so she becomes the object of great love. And not only that, but she becomes personified as the bride of Christ. And this kind of bothered some people for a while. It has some interesting connotations that Mary is shown as the bride of Christ. So this was sort of changed to show the church as the bride of Christ, which is what this picture is here. This is in your book also. Mary is now shown as taking over the judgment role of Christ. No longer is God the judge, but Mary is. And here is the devil as a joke. And here he is seen as a joke. He's not a real person, but he is laughable and unreal. So this accounts for the discovery of the individual by Colin Morris, the value of human beings in God's image. And this is the essence of the 12th century Renaissance, the flowering of the Middle Ages. So we will continue next week. Yeah.